Hi, we continue in Luke 19 today in what is often known as the parable of the pounds, but what I'm calling a warning against eschatological exuberance. And we get that title that I'm giving it because the narrator has told us at the beginning of the story what it was for. Jesus tells us because they were near Jerusalem and those around him believed that the kingdom of God would appear immediately. And even though the narrator has given us this clear purpose of the parable, the history of scholarship is of much misinterpretation until very recently, as I went over last time. So I won't go over all the elements I went over last time. I'll just touch on them now, but I'd really encourage you to watch the last video if you want to know the first part of this story. So we've been looking, this entire unit from 1711 to 1948 is about preparing the disciples for Jesus' rejection and their own rejection, and our scene here is plainly about that, about resistors to Rome or Jerusalem are punished severely, as we're about to see. And we've also been noting the link between the chiastic parallels, that this story is a warning that Jerusalem will not welcome him and his disciples, as we saw at the very beginning of the travel narrative, that the Samaritans refused to welcome him. And we're also continuing to look at these faulty presuppositions, both that is the one I just illustrated, that we need to read all these passages in relation to their chiastic partners, not just alone, but more particularly in our situation, that the nobleman and who seeks royal power is Jesus. And as I went through last time, and again, these are posted so I won't go over them again, the history of interpretation has led us from these ancient allegorical methods to more modern ones where Jesus is the nobleman, to the capitalist reading about taking good stewardship of your resources, to trying to separate the, quote, real parable that Jesus told from Luke's editorial, quote unquote, frame. And as I noted last time, Van Eck, writing from South Africa, says it's important to note that all the previous interpretations, without exception, interpret the nobleman and the parable as a positive figure, praise the actions of the first two slaves, and vilify the third. So because that's what all those various interpretive methods lead to, scholars have discovered two others. One is social scientific, which we're using to look at the socioeconomic context, and also as a parody. And we'll see several examples of linguistic connections here between earlier parts of Luke that really highlight that what's being told here is a parody of the reign of God, which is to say how things work in the reign of Caesar, which Jesus is about to encounter, and the disciples are too, when they enter into Jerusalem. So we've also been noting, and there's one element of this that's relevant today at the very end, how Luke has built his story here around Josephus' account of the journey of Herod Archelaus to Rome to get kingship over Judea. And at the end, he has resistors slaughtered, just as the nobleman in this story who got royal power does as well. So those are all elements that link our story to the proper interpretation. And here, in the terms of key words, we're looking in this section starting here, and I made in red here all the different words, noun and verb, around kingship. So rather than receive royal power, I translated it more literally to take the kingship for himself, which many scholars have noted is what it literally means. The parts in the orange underlined here without the bold are words that are either unique in this passage in the New Testament or almost so. And there's a couple in particular that we're going to see that are important here that help us make our interpretation. So we'll leave that up as we return in verse 16 to our story here. So having gone to get the power, he comes back and he's summoning the 10 slaves to see what they did with the money. And I noted last time the 10 slaves here are parallel in this whole unit to the 10 lepers at the beginning, where one came back to praise God and Jesus asked rhetorically, where are the other 9? And here in our story down here, although 10 are sent out, we only hear about 1, 2, and then the other, and we don't hear about the 7. But the 1 here is parallel to the 1 leper who offers praise, and we'll see how that works as we go. So let's put our keywords back up and we'll jump into it. So the first came forward, paragonamai here, we see it a number of times, coming forward, and said. And notice how all of them call this person Lord, and that wrongly leads many to think, well, that must mean Jesus, but plainly not. The word Kyrios, much like the Spanish Señor, can be used to refer to Jesus the Lord, but also means what in English would be Sir, a respectful title for a man spoken by someone in a subservient position. And plainly these slaves could call him Master Despotes, as we've seen earlier, but Kyrios is certainly a proper title for a slave to refer to his master. But the point plainly is that this is a different kind of Lord, and this Lord plainly is about serving mammon here. We already saw back in chapter 16 that Jesus said, you cannot serve God and mammon, which led the Pharisees, as stand-ins for Luke's Roman audience, to scoff at him and be told by the narrator in 16:14 that they were lovers of silver, and silver is exactly what's at issue in this story. So if the Pharisees back in chapter 16 16 represent Luke's Roman audience. Here the money as well represents the religion of empire, as I call it, and it's concerned with giving, as Jesus will say, those who already have more and taking away from those who have little. But we'll see how that's a contrast with what Jesus said in the same way, but meaning something very different about his own discipleship and the reign of God. So the first one comes back and says, your pound has made 10 more pounds. Prosargosito, one of the words here that's used exclusively here. And 10 more. The one made 10. That's quite a profit. Tenfold profit. We're not told how long it was, but he got tenfold profit. And so the response is, well done, good slave, because you've been trustworthy in a very small thing. Take charge of 10 cities. We're going to look at that in more detail. But notice what's at issue. As I noted last time, quoting Vincent, that the 10 minas represent a small amount of money, really, for someone as powerful as this. And what we discover now in verse 17 is it was a little experiment. It was a little test to see if they could handle a small amount of money and now have something much more important, plainly 10 cities, which would be not that much less than what Archelaus had as an ethnarch, as not a king of the entire area, but dividing it up. There weren't that many cities, but this is a parable, not a realistic story that way. So let's look more detail at the words that respond. Well done here. Euge is, again, as I noted here, only here in the New Testament. But notice how it phonetically matches the nobleman who is eugenes, of good birth. And using a unique word here, Luke could have used many other words for saying good or good job or something like that. But plainly, this is meant to connect in the royal kind of language we see here. So, well done, good slave. You've been trustworthy using pistis, which is the word for faith that we see regularly. And as I've noted all along, although Christians tend to translate pistis as faith, more broadly it means things like trust or confidence or any other kind of thing that suggests you're putting trust or faith, as we say, in a situation or in another. So they've been tested to see how faithful they are. Remember back in chapter 18, after the story of the judge and the widow, Jesus asked rhetorically, when the human one comes, will he find faith on earth? And we've seen a couple examples of faith among characters, but here's faith in the imperial perspective. Here, faith means making more money so the rich can get richer. The word for a very small thing is also important here, elakasto here, and it very explicitly draws back, as a number of scholars have noted, 16:10. So let's look at that at the end of the story of the unjust manager, or the manager of injustice, as I called it there. So Jesus concludes that story with this: whoever is faithful, using pistos, in a very little, using elakasto, is also faithful in much, and whoever is unjust, not dishonest here, but unjust as we looked at the time, and a very little is dishonest or unjust in much. And so in both examples, the argument is if you are a certain way in a small thing, you'll be the same way in a big thing, but using exactly the language of faithful and a little thing in both examples. So here, it's the imperial perspective, that when someone in power gives you something and you're shown to be trustworthy in their sense, which is to make them richer, then you can get more imperial authority. The phrase for take charge here is have authority, but it's literally have authority over. The New RSV omits apano, the word for over, which is the same one for rule over here. Plainly a hierarchical element, greatly contrary to everything that Jesus is about with the sermon on the level place in Luke's gospel. And as we'll see, the disciples here are told that they will share, 12 of them will share a throne, or sit on 12 thrones, so shared distributed power rather than power over, as we see here as a symbol. So many examples of why this can't be a parable where Jesus is the nobleman. So the second one comes and says, your pound is made, using a different word here. I'm using the ordinary word for made, 5. And so in parallel, he gets 5 cities. And here just become above. So it doesn't have authority, but it's the same idea. So you are now above 5 cities. And we won't look at the Matthew comparison because I noted last time the stories are really very different. So here the other comes. And notice, where are the other 7? We were told there were 10. He comes back, he speaks to one, he speaks to a second, and now the other. Again, making a parallel to the leper, because why do we need to know there's 10? Why didn't he just say he sent out 3? Or he sent out some? But the 10 is what makes the link. So Here's the other, and this is key because as I was noting from Van Eck's quote at the beginning of our video today, all other interpretations make this guy the villain because he's not being productive or he's not making the master, the Lord here, richer. But plainly, I hope you'll hear, he's the one that represents discipleship. He's the one, as we'll hear, who interrupts the imperial economy in the small way he can and is willing to face the consequences. So here's what happens. He comes saying, and as Herzog notes as we listen, as anticipate the speech, the third servant's speech would have astonished the hearers. He cuts through the mystifying rhetoric that has dominated the exchange between the elite and his first two retainers, and he identifies the aristocrat for what he is: strict, cruel, harsh, and merciless. So let's listen. Lord, here is your pound, or Edu, behold, here is your pound. I wrapped it up in a piece of cloth. The piece of cloth is Sudarian, like the cloth that covers Jesus and the cloth that covered Lazarus as well, but an ordinary piece of cloth. So he wrapped it up in a piece of cloth and took it out of circulation. And from a capitalist interpretation, of course, this is bad. You should have invested it and made more money. And no wonder he's going to be slaughtered at the end. But is that how anybody can understand that God works it? If you're not a profitable enough capitalist, you're going to be slaughtered? It's really amazing how long that kind of distorted interpretation has reigned. But fortunately, we have a different one here. So he says, here's why. Here's why he wrapped it in a cloth. For I was afraid of you. And as my note has a realistic description of the practices of elite landowners, I was afraid of you because you're an austere man. Austros, another word that's only here in the next verse, as we see. And here's why he is that. You take what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow. In other words, as my note below has, one who exploits the hard work of others for their own profit, and it can easily include the benefits of the taxes gathered by Zacchaeus and company, his fellow tax collectors. So literally what you did not put. You take where you did not put, and you reap where you did not sow, which is two versions of the same thing. In other words, other people are doing the work, and you're just getting the cream off the top. So not only is he austere in that sense, but he's an exploiter and an oppressor as well. Plainly, the exact opposite of Jesus. And notice in verse 22, the nobleman, now an ethnarch, does not deny the truth of the characterization. Instead, he simply questions the response given that characterization. Yet again, a clear message that this can't be Jesus speaking here. He says, I will judge you by your own words, literally out of your own mouth, you wicked slave. And as Herzog notes, having spoken the truth, the servant must be vilified, shamed, and humiliated so that his words will carry no weight. And of course, we see that all the time in our world where someone who's a whistleblower is accused of sexual improprieties or others, anything to avoid the elite having to face the challenge that they're unjust or even criminal. So he's characterized as a wicked slave here. How is he wicked? Because he didn't make enough money is the reason he'd be wicked here. You knew, did I, that I was a harsh man, taking what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Notice how he quotes virtually verbatim exactly what the charge is and doesn't challenge it at all. So given that, he asks, why then did you not put my money into the bank? And bank is over-determining, as if they had a place you could walk in the door and talk to a teller. Rather, the word for bank, trapeza, simply means a table, which could be a table for eating or for banking. It's a traditional image of what we see in Matthew and Mark for Jesus turning over the tables of the money changers. But interestingly, the word trapeza is not used in that scene in Luke, who truncates the scene tremendously, as we'll see when we get there. So why did you not put your money in on the table? Because when I returned, I could have collected it with interest. Using the word toko in this form here, and only here in its parallel in Matthew in the New Testament, as you can see here. But plainly, Jesus could never be calling people to be characterized as evil because they refuse to allow someone to make interest on their money, since Luke's gospel is all about Jubilee. As we heard back in chapter 4 from Luke's opening sermon in Nazareth, taken from Isaiah 61, as we heard, everything about Jubilee is releasing debts that happen because of interest and not charging interest. Let's look at a couple of examples here from Leviticus 25. Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from them, but fear your God, let them live with you. This is about strangers. You shall not lend them your money at interest taken in advance or provide them food at a profit, because I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. and took care of you. So plainly in Deuteronomy 23 we see a very similar thing. Loans to a foreigner you may charge interest, but on loans to another Israelite you may not charge interest. And there's no sense of the ethnic identity of these characters here, and plainly the nobleman is not an Israelite in any way, plainly a Roman. But to the idea that it could be Jesus, there's no way that Jesus could be chastising someone for doing something if prohibited by the Torah in multiple situations. But it's not just that it's prohibited. It runs completely contrary to Jesus' whole economic plan here, which is the release of debts and the restoration of justice to those who have been exploited by the rich, just like this nobleman and his system. So the nobleman continues, and he said, Luke adding here to Matthew's version, adds to the bystanders a word, peristosin, which literally is from a verb meaning to cause to be, so those who are just there. Take the pound from him and give it to the one who has 10. Notice he feels like he can order everybody around. These are not necessarily the other slaves. They're just people around there in the royal situation. And they object, at least rhetorically they object, and they said to him, Lord, he has 10 pounds. And I know, again, Luke adds this expression of surprise from the they here. But he continues, I tell you, to all those who have, more will be given, but from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And that's where we have to hear the deep irony of what Luke's doing here. So let's go back and look at 8:18, where we hear, pay attention to how you listen. For those who have, more will be given, and for those who do not have, even what they seem to have will be taken away. And this has to do, of course, I shouldn't say of course, you might not be familiar with it, with the scene we see back in Luke 8 about the tree and soil and seeing in the light. And so here it's in the context of nothing that's hidden will not be disclosed, or nothing secret will not come to light. And Jesus is encouraging them to be people who can see so that more light, more insight will be given to them. So that's what they would get. They get more insight and more understanding of God. But here, more those who have money or power will be given more, and from those who don't, it will be taken away. And then the really dark conclusion that you'd think would make anybody think this can't be Jesus, but it hasn't stopped people until recently, as Van Eck's comment noted, and as the other scholars I've been citing also note. But as for these enemies of mine, and of course, what do we know about Jesus saying about enemies? You should love them. You should give to them without worrying about it, without thinking about it. Love them and give to them like you give to everybody without thought of reward. But here is what he does. For as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bringing back the point from back here from verse 4, notice it's not the person who hid it in the cloth who's told to be slaughtered, although he could be included with that. So the coin is taken away from the resistor, but all those who did not want to be king, bring them here and slaughter them in my presence. Katis phagate here, perhaps a play on agagate to lead them. But as Dowling notes, of the 11 uses in the Septuagint, 8 are in 2nd Maccabees. And she notes further that passage and the current Luke passage are the only places where this word is found with polites, citizens. So as you can hear in one key section of the passage in 2nd Maccabees, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid leader who is crushing Jerusalem and leads to the Maccabees' revolt, we hear this, and he commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to slay those who went into the houses. Then there was killing of young and old, destruction of boys, women, and children, and slaughter of virgins and infants, using this same word a whole series of times, 8 times, and a few of them in this passage. So plainly the audience is meant to hear this, that this is what kings do. They slaughter people who disagree with them. They crush dissent. And so that's what's at issue with this story, that as they approach Jerusalem, they should not expect a grand celebration that everyone will be so thrilled that the Messiah has come and we're finally going to whip the Romans. What will happen instead, as Jesus warned them, that he'd be turned over, that he'd be rejected, that he'd be beaten up and killed, but that he would rise on the 3rd day. And as we enter Jerusalem, we'll have to see whether the disciples' eyes or ears are open to be able to understand what Jesus is about before it's too late. We'll complete our journey to Jerusalem in the next couple of videos. See you for them next time.